So my name is Lena Hadsbjerg. I believe in the power of storytelling to connect us as human beings, but also to nature. And today we have a special guest, Brad Robertson, here talking with us. Brad is one of the founders of Save the Med Foundation and is a great ambassador for the Mediterranean Sea. So I want to try and travel a bit back in time. I want to get an understanding of what the ocean means to you and where was this love, where was it born?
Wow, there's a heavy question. I grew up on the east coast of Australia, and I think that pretty much sums it up. I remember as a kid living in a place called Avalon on the northern beaches of Sydney, and collecting whatever I could, taking home, putting it in aquariums, not having a lot of luck as a young kid, to be honest. But then I started diving when I was 18. I did a lot of diving in and around Sydney, and then I think late 20s I headed up to Cairns in North Queensland, did my dive masters. I said to myself, I'll go up there for a year, do my dive masters and think about what I want to do when I grow up. And I'm still thinking about what I want to do when I grow up. So it was 20 years or more of diving. I think every human being has a connection to the sea, and if you give yourself enough time to get comfortable, everyone would feel the same connection and the same passion. So I think it's just a natural evolution from so many years underwater.
And often, so when one speaks of the Great Barrier Reef, it's one of those epic locations. I haven't been there myself, but it just creates this imagination of wonder, of underwater wonder. Give us a picture of the Great Barrier Reef and what it was that you've had many dives in that area. What is it that has captivated you about that area?
Well, it's given me goosebumps just thinking about diving back home on the reef. Now, Osprey Reef is an old volcano, comes out of 2,000 meters of water. It's a steam overnight. You wake up in the morning, sun's coming up, you're in the middle of the coral sea, no land anywhere, and you have this big blue, green, turquoise, spectacular reef in front of you. You jump in the water there. You've got plate corals, fan corals. You've got anemones everywhere. You've got massive schools of fish. But there you've got big mantas, big hammerheads, and that's where we conducted the shark feed, which was the last job I did in North Queensland. And being immersed in that sort of environment, that sort of pristine environment, where there are no developments, where there's no machines, it's just pure nature in yourself. It's a very, very special location, and it's a super special experience. And I remember the tourists that we used to look after on those boats. These were life-changing experiences for these people. I remember sitting at 5 meters doing a safety stop after giving my fins up to the dive master on the boat, looking after the clients, and just staying there for 5 minutes to get a bit of disconnection. And then you feel this weird sensation and look around, and there's a 5 meter minke whale, like half a meter from you, stopped in mid-water, staring at you, eyeballing you. So you return the favor, and those connections are absolutely spectacular. And I never expected to have anything close to that in the Med. So when we arrived here 10 years ago, I dived in Ietas, of all places. So I went from Osprey Reef to Ietas, so it was a little bit of a, would you say, nature shock. And then I started to get to know our scientific team, and they started to introduce me to locations. And there are some locations in the Balearics where I have exactly the same feeling as I do in the Great Barrier Reef, and that's amazing. Most people think, when they think of the Mediterranean, they think of a really dead sea, there's no life. But I can tell you, some of the most amazing dives and the most amazing underwater experiences I've had have been right here in the Med. Wow.
I feel encouraged to hear that as well. It just helps give the motivation of what it is that we're preserving on these islands. But then, Brad, there's always there's terminology. So you talk about marine conservation, and focusing on marine regeneration and trying to understand the differentiation between that. Like, where is it that we're moving to when it comes to preserving these pristine seas in the Mediterranean?
Well, I think it's 2020 now. We're in the middle of an international crisis. There's a lot of realizations happening around the world, I think, with individuals and groups of people, different communities. And one of those very obvious realizations is that conservation in 2020, what that word by definition means is nowhere near enough. I don't have the motivation and the inspiration, and neither does the team at Save the Med, to conserve what's here. We want to see the Mediterranean regenerate. We want to put in actions and plans and collaborations that will allow her to regenerate to the beauty that she once was. And the fact that the Balearic Sea, the Balearic Islands here in the Western Mediterranean, we're in this little pocket of marine paradise that still has a lot of regenerating to do. But the fact that there are areas here that are quite well preserved, that should give the rest of the Med that inspiration that hey, it can happen. And this is, I think, one of the biggest differences between conservation and regeneration. And we changed the terminology when we became Save the Med. And it's one of those words, when you say regeneration to somebody, they stop and they think. You say conservation to somebody and they hold their wallets, you know what I mean? That's the normal response. They're like, oh yeah. So to try and change the dialogue and change people's responses, and just getting people to think about one word without going into all of the technicalities, I think is a very, very powerful thing to do.
So that kind of leads me on. So how do we go about doing that? And I mean, I'm personally a strong believer of creating both nature reserves on land, marine protected areas, but what does that actually mean? And what does it entail to try and preserve what we have and regenerate, which is what you say is your mission?
Yeah, well, I mean, marine protected areas, marine reserves, there are various scientific and legal frameworks that different areas fit into. I think the general public is not super interested in all the different little details. Protection is protection in a lot of people's eyes. But what we, the base of all of this is to just give the sea specific areas based on scientific knowledge and data. So protecting areas that have more chance to regenerate is the first step to identify these areas. But then a good management plan. And you look at countries like New Zealand or Australia, there's a lot of no-take areas, which means that you cannot do anything in these areas. You can potentially dive and do non-extractive activities, so no fishing. What I learned a lot about was how artisanal fishermen can fit into the natural environment and become, in fact, from my point of view, what I've learned over the last 10 years, they are part of this environment. They're custodians, they manage it, they understand it, and they fish with small scale artisanal style fisheries, which in some cases, and if you look at the mahi-mahi fisheries here in Majorca, it's one of the most sustainable fisheries in the world. So there's a lot to be learned from incorporating artisanal fishing in and around MPAs. Now, a lot of people, particularly from Oz, the States, when they think of a marine protected area, it must be no take. There's nothing to happen inside. But I am now in the mindset that, hang on a minute, things are not that black and white. What happens if you allow certain types of artisanal fishing in or around a marine reserve? And if you look at the data from El Toro, and El Toro's been protected for 10 or 15 years, and the biomass of the fish keeps increasing, and there are types of fishing that are allowed there. I'm not saying all the types of fishing that are allowed there I agree with, and there's always going to be these little arguments back and forth. However, I think here in Europe, if we really want to conserve the marine environment, we need to embrace the local artisanal fisheries. We need to work with them. We need to learn from them. There's nobody in the Med that knows the Med better than these people. And unfortunately, the age demographics of these people is getting older. There's not a lot of young people coming through. So it really is another part of the marine environment that's under threat of extinction.
And so, in closing, Brad, how can we help? How can we become part of the Save the Med generation? How can we actively engage and contribute?
I think whether you become part of Save the Med generation or whether you become part of another group's generation, as long as your values are aligned, if you can contribute anything at all, and this is the beauty of what Save the Med does, and many other groups, Cleanwave as well. There's various levels of ability to contribute. You don't have to be Mr. or Mrs. Billionaire to be important to an NGO. The volunteers that come to the beach cleans, they are critically important. Without them, we can't do our work. So everybody has their part. And if people have got the ability to give time, give skills, then yeah, get involved with a local NGO, definitely.